Have you ever found yourself in the eye of a storm, where the chaos of life seems to swirl around you with such ferocity that you can barely catch your breath? Perhaps you're there right now, feeling the weight of responsibilities, the pressure of expectations, and the constant noise of a world that never seems to pause. In those moments, when the mind races and the heart pounds, there exists a peculiar kind of suffering that feels uniquely yours, yet is universally experienced. It's that sense of being completely overtaken by circumstances, as if you were a leaf caught in a rushing river, helpless against the current, desperately searching for something solid to hold on to. The modern world has conditioned us to believe that control comes from gripping tighter, from pushing harder, from resisting with all our might. Yet this very resistance, this attachment to controlling outcomes, is often the source of our deepest suffering. I've spent decades exploring the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern consciousness, and I've witnessed countless individuals trapped in this cycle of attachment and suffering. The symptoms are unmistakable: the mind constantly projecting into a future that hasn't arrived, or dwelling in a past that cannot be changed. The body responds with tension, manifesting as physical pain, disrupted sleep, digestive issues, or a general sense of unease that seems to have no clear source. There's a persistent feeling of disconnect between who you truly are and the person you present to the world. You may find yourself exhausted by the constant effort to maintain control, yet terrified of what might happen if you simply let go. This state of being attached to outcomes while fearing their uncertainty creates a prison of anxiety, where peace feels not just elusive but almost mythical, something others might achieve, but which remains perpetually out of your reach. I understand deeply how disheartening this cycle can be. When you're caught in its grip, even the suggestion that there might be another way can seem like a cruel oversimplification of your very real struggles. The pain you feel is valid. The exhaustion is real. The sense of being overwhelmed by forces larger than yourself is not an illusion but a genuine experience of the human condition. In a world that often dismisses spiritual suffering as weakness or lack of resilience, know that your yearning for peace is not only natural but profoundly wise. It is, in fact, your true self, calling you home to a state of being that exists beyond the constant fluctuations of external circumstances. This call is not a rejection of life's complexities, but an invitation to engage with them from a place of greater wisdom and stability. What if I told you that the peace you seek is not dependent on the world around you becoming more peaceful? What if this quality of inner calm, of detachment from outcomes while remaining fully engaged with life, is actually your natural state? Consider for a moment that beneath the layers of conditioning, beyond the strategies of control that you've developed to navigate an uncertain world, there exists a dimension of your being that remains untouched by chaos. This isn't about escaping reality or denying the challenges that life presents. Rather, it's about discovering a different relationship with those challenges, one that allows you to respond with clarity instead of react from fear. The art of inner detachment is not about disconnecting from life, but about connecting more deeply with the unchanging awareness that witnesses all of life's changes. Throughout our time together, I'll guide you through an exploration of this ancient wisdom reframed for our modern context. You'll discover practical techniques drawn from timeless traditions that have helped countless individuals find their center even in life's most turbulent moments. We'll explore the science behind how attachment creates suffering in the mind and body, and how the practice of conscious detachment can transform not only your inner experience, but also the quality of your relationships, work, and creative expression. You'll learn to distinguish between healthy striving and the kind of desperate grasping that leads to disappointment and burnout. Most importantly, you'll begin to experience moments of genuine inner freedom, not as a distant goal to achieve someday, but as an immediate reality available in this very moment, regardless of your circumstances. When we feel overwhelmed by life's challenges, our natural response is often to tighten our grip, to control more, to resist what is happening. We believe that our suffering comes from the chaotic circumstances themselves. But the deeper truth is that much of our pain comes from our relationship with those circumstances. The mind becomes fixated on what should be happening rather than what is actually unfolding. This creates a division in our consciousness, a split between reality and our idea of reality. This division is the birthplace of suffering. The ancient Vedic texts speak of this as the fundamental misidentification, mistaking our true nature of pure awareness for the temporary conditions that awareness is witnessing. When we are caught in this misidentification, peace seems impossible, because we're searching for it in the realm of changing phenomena, rather than in the unchanging field of consciousness itself. The paradox that many spiritual seekers encounter is that the very effort to find peace often takes them further from it. This is because peace is not something to be attained, but something to be recognized as already present. Imagine yourself as the vast blue sky, and all your thoughts, emotions, and the events of your life as clouds passing through. Some clouds are light and wispy, others dark and turbulent. But regardless of the weather patterns, the sky itself remains unchanged, untouched, ever present. This unchanging quality is your essential nature, what I often refer to as the field of pure potentiality or consciousness itself. The clouds are not separate from the sky. They are temporary expressions within it. Similarly, all the changing circumstances of your life are not separate from your true nature, but are expressions within the field of your awareness. The practice of inner detachment begins with this recognition that you are not the limited, separate self, struggling to control an unpredictable world, but rather the field of awareness in which all experience arises. This is not merely a philosophical concept, but a direct experience available to anyone who turns their attention toward the witness of their thoughts, rather than remaining absorbed in the thoughts themselves. When you begin to identify with the witnessing awareness rather than with the content of your awareness, a profound shift occurs. You discover that peace is not dependent on peaceful circumstances. It is your fundamental nature regardless of circumstances. This is why some individuals can maintain remarkable equanimity even in the midst of tremendous challenges, while others struggle to find peace even when their external conditions are relatively comfortable. Have you noticed how your relationship with life's challenges transforms when you shift from resistance to acceptance? I'm not speaking of passive resignation, but of a clear-eyed recognition of what is actually happening in this moment. When we resist reality, we expend enormous energy fighting against what already is. This resistance creates tension in the body, agitation in the mind, and a profound sense of separation from the flow of life. But when we practice acceptance, which is a form of detachment from our demand that reality be different, we reclaim that energy. We move from exhaustion to vitality, from fragmentation to wholeness. I invite you to take a moment right now to notice if there's something in your current experience that you're resisting. Perhaps it's a physical sensation, an emotion, a thought, or a situation in your life. Can you feel the quality of that resistance in your body? Now, experiment with simply allowing that experience to be as it is, without trying to change it or push it away. Notice what happens in your body and mind when you practice this simple form of detachment. I'd like to ask you a question that touches the heart of our human experience. What are you holding on to so tightly that it's preventing you from experiencing peace? If this question resonates with you, I invite you to share in the comments below. I'm learning to detach from fill in what you're working to release. Your sharing creates a field of healing not only for yourself, but for countless others walking a similar path. In acknowledging our attachments, we take the first step toward freedom from them. I've witnessed remarkable transformations begin with this simple act of naming what we're ready to release. The patterns that hold us captive often lose their power when brought into the light of conscious awareness. And in this community, you're not alone in your journey. Your words may be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to begin their own process of healing and liberation. The courage to be vulnerable creates ripples of possibility far beyond what we can see. I understand how challenging it can be to acknowledge our attachments, especially when they've become so familiar that they feel like part of our identity. There's often a subtle fear that if we let go of controlling outcomes, our lives might fall apart. Yet the opposite is true. When we release our rigid demands on how life should unfold, we create space for solutions and possibilities that our controlling mind could never have imagined. This isn't about surrendering our power, but about aligning with a greater intelligence that flows through all of life. I've sat with thousands of individuals over the years who were initially terrified to loosen their grip on controlling their circumstances, only to discover that what awaited them was not chaos but a profound sense of trust in life itself. This trust doesn't come from naively believing everything will be easy, but from knowing that whatever arises, you have access to a place within that remains undisturbed. A perspective that sees beyond immediate challenges to the larger patterns at work. The wisdom traditions teach us that attachment is the root cause of suffering, but this teaching is often misunderstood. Detachment doesn't mean not caring or withdrawing from active participation in life. Rather, it means engaging fully but without the desperate clinging to particular outcomes that creates anxiety and disappointment. Consider how a skilled sailor works with the wind rather than against it, adjusting the sails to harness its power regardless of which direction it blows. The sailor doesn't control the wind, but develops the wisdom to work in harmony with it. Similarly, the art of inner detachment is about developing the wisdom to work with life's circumstances, rather than exhausting ourselves by resisting them. This requires a fundamental shift in how we understand our relationship with life, from seeing ourselves as separate entities fighting against external forces, to recognizing ourselves as expressions of the same intelligence that gives rise to all of existence. The Bhagavad Gita, one of the great wisdom texts, speaks of karma yoga, the yoga of action without attachment to results. This doesn't mean not caring about outcomes, but rather performing right action because it is right, regardless of whether it brings the specific results we desire. When our actions are motivated primarily by attachment to particular outcomes, we suffer when those outcomes don't materialize as expected. But when our actions are aligned with our deeper values and performed with full presence, there's a quality of fulfillment that isn't dependent on external validation or specific results. This is the freedom that comes from inner detachment, the ability to act with full commitment while releasing the burden of controlling precisely how things unfold. Consider for a moment how much of your mental and emotional energy is consumed by thoughts about what might happen in the future or ruminations about what happened in the past. The mind constantly projects forward in an attempt to control what hasn't yet occurred, or reaches backward trying to change what cannot be changed. But life only ever happens in this present moment. The past exists as memory, the future is imagination, but your actual lived experience is always now. When we practice inner detachment, we're essentially bringing our attention back to this moment, releasing the mental projections that create anxiety about the future or regret about the past. This return to presence is both the simplest and the most challenging spiritual practice, because the conditioned mind continually pulls us away from the now, where true peace resides. The great spiritual teacher J. Krishnamurti once said, "The highest form of intelligence is the ability to observe without evaluating." This speaks to a quality of detached awareness that doesn't immediately label experiences as good or bad, but simply witnesses what is with clarity. Most of our suffering comes not from the experiences themselves, but from our judgments about those experiences. When something happens that doesn't align with our preferences or expectations, we immediately categorize it as bad, which triggers resistance and emotional reactivity. But what if we could observe our experiences with greater neutrality, recognizing that our limited perspective can't possibly see how current challenges might be serving our growth or leading to opportunities we can't yet imagine? This doesn't mean denying genuine pain or difficulty, but rather holding our experiences in a wider context that allows for meaning and possibility beyond our immediate reactions. One of the most powerful practices for developing inner detachment is meditation, not as an escape from reality, but as a means of training the mind to rest in awareness itself, rather than being constantly pulled into identification with thoughts, emotions, and sensory experiences. When we meditate regularly, we strengthen our capacity to observe the contents of our consciousness without becoming completely absorbed in them. We begin to recognize that thoughts and emotions are like weather patterns moving through our awareness, sometimes turbulent, sometimes peaceful, but never defining the totality of who we are. This recognition creates a subtle but profound shift in our relationship with difficult experiences. Rather than saying, "I am anxious" or "I am angry," which suggests a total identification with those states, we begin to recognize, "I am experiencing anxiety," or "anger is arising in my awareness." This simple shift in language reflects a deeper shift in consciousness, from identification with changing phenomena to recognition of ourselves as the unchanging awareness in which all phenomena arise and pass away. The practice of inner detachment also transforms our relationships with others. When we're caught in attachment, we often relate to people based on how well they fulfill our needs and expectations. We love them when they behave as we want and resist them when they don't. This conditional quality of relationship creates enormous suffering for both parties. But when we practice inner detachment, we begin to see others not as extensions of our needs and preferences, but as expressions of consciousness on their own journey. This doesn't mean we don't have boundaries or that we accept mistreatment, but rather that our love becomes less conditional, less dependent on others conforming to our expectations. We can honor our own truth while allowing others the freedom to be who they are. This shift from attachment-based relationships to presence-based relationships is one of the most liberating aspects of the spiritual journey. As we deepen our understanding of inner detachment, we begin to recognize how much of our suffering comes from resistance to what Eckhart Tolle calls the isness of the present moment. We have an idea of how things should be, how people should behave, how our lives should unfold, and when reality doesn't match these mental constructs, we suffer. The practice of acceptance, which is a form of detachment, doesn't mean we never act to change circumstances that can be changed, but rather that we stop arguing with reality itself. As the spiritual teacher Byron Katie often asks, when you argue with reality, you lose, but only 100% of the time. This simple but profound truth points to the liberation that comes when we release our attachment to our mental demands on life and instead meet each moment with openness and clarity. The paradox of inner detachment is that when we release our desperate grip on controlling life, we often find that life flows more harmoniously. This isn't because we've somehow manipulated external reality through our detachment, but because our perception and response to reality have fundamentally changed. When we're not caught in resistance, our actions come from a place of greater wisdom and alignment. We see opportunities we might have missed when blinded by attachment to particular outcomes. We access creative solutions that weren't available to the problem-solving mind caught in anxiety. We develop a trust in the unfolding of life that isn't based on naive optimism, but on direct experience of how surrender often leads to more favorable outcomes than control. This doesn't mean we become passive or abdicate responsibility, but rather that we learn to dance with life instead of fighting against it. Another dimension of inner detachment involves our relationship with the ego identity. The ego is not something to be destroyed or transcended in the sense of getting rid of it, but rather something to be recognized for what it is, a useful but limited self-reference point, rather than our fundamental identity. The ego serves important functions in navigating the relative world, but suffering arises when we mistake this constructed self-image for who we truly are. Inner detachment involves a gentle disidentification with the ego's constant concerns about how it's being perceived, whether it's getting what it wants, and how it compares to others. As we practiced witnessing these ego concerns rather than being completely identified with them, we discover a sense of self that is more spacious, more connected to all of life, and less dependent on external validation for its sense of worth. The spiritual path is often described as a journey from the head to the heart, from the analytical mind to the wisdom of the heart's intelligence. The mind operates primarily through division and categorization, breaking reality into manageable pieces, separating self from other, past from present, from future. While this analytical capacity serves important functions, it also creates the sense of separation that underlies much of our suffering. The heart, by contrast, operates through connection and wholeness. When we shift our center of gravity from head to heart, which is another way of describing the journey of inner detachment, we begin to experience ourselves, not as isolated entities in a threatening world, but as expressions of a unified field of consciousness. This doesn't mean abandoning the mind's discernment, but rather placing it in service to the heart's wisdom. From this integration comes a quality of being that can engage fully with life's challenges without becoming defined or limited by them. The art of inner detachment also transforms our relationship with time. When we're caught in attachment, we're often either anxiously projecting into the future or regretfully dwelling in the past. The present moment, where life actually happens, receives only a fraction of our attention. But as we practice detachment from our mental projections, we naturally return to presence. We discover that there is only ever this moment, and in this moment, there is a quality of completeness that doesn't depend on anything being different than it is. Even in the midst of working toward future goals or healing past wounds, our primary point of reference becomes the now. This shift from time-bound consciousness to presence doesn't mean we don't plan for the future or learn from the past, but rather that we do so from a grounded awareness of this moment, rather than from a state of psychological identification with past or future. One of the most beautiful aspects of inner detachment is how it affects our relationship with the natural world. When we're caught in the mind's attachments, we often relate to nature as something separate from ourselves, a resource to be used or a backdrop to our human drama. But as we practice detachment from our limited self-concept, we begin to experience our fundamental interconnectedness with all of life. The boundaries between self and world become more permeable. We recognize that the same intelligence that flows through us flows through all of existence. This shift in perception naturally gives rise to a deeper reverence for the natural world and a more harmonious way of living within it. We move from exploitation to stewardship, from separation to participation. This isn't based on moral imperatives, but on direct recognition of our inseparability from the web of life. As we continue to explore the art of inner detachment, it's important to address some common misunderstandings. Detachment doesn't mean becoming emotionally cold or disconnected from the human experience. In fact, the opposite is true. When we're not caught in the mind's attachments and resistances, we're able to experience emotions more fully, but without becoming overwhelmed by them. There's a quality of allowing emotions to move through us rather than defining us. Joy can be experienced completely without grasping at it. Grief can be felt deeply without being consumed by it. The witness consciousness that is cultivated through detachment doesn't diminish our humanity, but rather allows us to embrace it more wholly, with less fear and resistance. Another misconception is that detachment leads to passivity or lack of motivation. Again, the truth is quite different. When we're driven primarily by attachment to outcomes, our motivation tends to fluctuate based on whether we're getting the results we want. This creates a fragile foundation for sustained action. But when we act from a place of inner detachment, committed to right action because it aligns with our values, regardless of specific outcomes, we develop a steadier, more resilient kind of motivation. This allows us to persist through challenges and setbacks without the dramatic emotional swings that come from attachment. We discover a quality of motivation that comes not from lack or fear, but from fullness and love. The practice of inner detachment also invites us to examine our relationship with success and failure. When we're attached to particular definitions of success, failure becomes something to be avoided at all costs. This creates tremendous anxiety and can actually inhibit performance and creativity. But when we practice detachment from fixed ideas of success and failure, we open to a more nuanced understanding of growth and achievement. We recognize that what appears as failure from one perspective might be a crucial learning opportunity from another. We become less defined by external metrics of success and more guided by internal values and the quality of presence we bring to our endeavors. This doesn't mean we don't strive for excellence, but rather that our striving comes from a different place, not from fear of failure, but from love of the journey itself. One of the most transformative aspects of inner detachment is how it affects our experience of love. When love is entangled with attachment, it becomes conditional and often leads to suffering. We love others for how they make us feel or what they provide for us, which means our love is always vulnerable to disappointment and withdrawal. But as we practice detachment from our needs and expectations, we discover a more unconditional quality of love, one that appreciates others for who they are, rather than for how well they fulfill our desires. This doesn't mean we don't have preferences or that we accept mistreatment, but rather that our love isn't dependent on getting what we want. We can honor others' freedom to be who they are, while also honoring our own truth. This more spacious, less demanding quality of love creates relationships with greater depth, authenticity, and resilience. The journey of inner detachment also transforms our relationship with the body. When we're caught in identification with the separate self, we often relate to the body either as something to be controlled and perfected, or as something that limits and betrays us. But as we practice detachment from fixed self-concepts, we begin to experience the body not as a possession of the self, but as a manifestation of consciousness itself. This shift allows for a more loving, collaborative relationship with the body's intelligence. Rather than imposing the mind's demands on the body, we learn to listen to the body's wisdom. We honor its needs for rest, movement, nourishment, and expression. We recognize that the body has its own intelligence that, when trusted, naturally moves toward balance and well-being. As we deepen our practice of inner detachment, we may begin to experience what the mystics call the peace that passes understanding. This isn't a peace that depends on peaceful circumstances, but rather a recognition of the peace that is always already present as our fundamental nature. This peace doesn't come and go with changing conditions, but remains accessible even in the midst of life's greatest challenges. It's not that difficulties disappear or that we never experience disturbance, but rather that we develop the capacity to access a dimension of being that remains undisturbed even when the surface of life is turbulent. This is the promise of all wisdom traditions, not a life without challenges, but the discovery of that within us which is equal to any challenge. I'd like to take a moment to honor the journey that has brought you to this exploration of inner detachment. The very fact that you've stayed with this teaching suggests a readiness within you to move beyond the limitations of attachment and into a more spacious way of being. This readiness is not something that can be manufactured by the will. It arises naturally when consciousness is prepared to expand beyond its current constraints. The spiritual journey is not linear but cyclical, with periods of expansion and contraction, clarity and confusion. Wherever you find yourself in this cycle, know that it is exactly where you need to be for your continued growth and awakening. There are no mistakes on the spiritual path, only opportunities for deeper understanding and integration. As we begin to close our time together, I want to acknowledge the profound step you've taken by engaging with these teachings on inner detachment. In a world that often values attachment, control, and acquisition, the willingness to explore a different way of being requires both courage and wisdom. You've given yourself the gift of this exploration, and whether you're just beginning to consider these ideas or have been practicing them for years, your presence in this moment is contributing to the evolution of consciousness itself. Every individual who awakens to a more detached, spacious way of being creates ripples that affect the collective field of humanity. Your journey is both deeply personal and part of something much larger than yourself. The beauty of the path of inner detachment is that it's available to you in every moment, regardless of external circumstances. You don't need special conditions or extended retreats to practice this art, though such dedicated time can certainly support your journey. The opportunity to practice detachment arises whenever you notice yourself caught in resistance to what is, whenever you find yourself anxiously attached to particular outcomes, whenever you're identified with limited concepts of who you are. In those moments, the simple act of noticing creates a space between you and the attachment. In that space lies the freedom to choose a different response, not from the conditioned mind, but from the unconditioned awareness that is your true nature. I invite you to continue this exploration with an open heart and a curious mind. The journey of inner detachment is not about reaching a final destination where you're perfectly detached from all human concerns. Rather, it's an ongoing dance of engagement and release, caring deeply while holding lightly. There will be moments of profound clarity and freedom, and there will be times when you find yourself caught once again in old patterns of attachment and resistance. This is not failure but simply the nature of the journey. Each time you notice yourself caught, each time you gently return to the witnessing awareness, you strengthen the muscle of consciousness. Over time, you may find that what once completely overwhelmed you now merely ripples the surface of your awareness, leaving the depths undisturbed. If you've found value in our exploration of the art of inner detachment, I invite you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. Each week, we dive into timeless wisdom reframed for our modern lives, exploring practices that support the journey from stress and separation to peace and wholeness. I'm deeply grateful for the step you've taken in being present for this teaching, and I honor the path that has brought you here. In subscribing, you're not just supporting the continuation of these teachings but also connecting with a global community of seekers walking a similar path. Together, we create a field of shared intention that supports each individual's awakening. The journey of consciousness is both deeply personal and inherently collective. As each of us awakens to our true nature, we contribute to the evolution of humanity itself. The wisdom I share comes from both ancient traditions and contemporary research, but its true value can only be discovered through your own direct experience. I encourage you to approach these teachings not as beliefs to be accepted on authority, but as invitations to exploration. Test them in the laboratory of your own life. Notice what happens when you practice inner detachment in the midst of challenges. Observe how your relationships transform when you love without the demands of attachment. Pay attention to the quality of your actions when they come from alignment rather than anxiety. This experiential knowledge is far more powerful than any concept or theory could ever be. As you continue to practice the art of inner detachment, you become not just a student of these teachings, but a living embodiment of them. Remember that the peace you seek is not dependent on anything outside yourself. It doesn't require different circumstances, different people, or even a different version of you. It is available in this very moment as your fundamental nature, the awareness that witnesses all experience but is not limited by any experience. In the timeless words of the Upanishads, that which permeates all, which nothing transcends, and which, like the universal space around us, fills everything completely from within and without. That supreme non-dual Brahman that thou art. This recognition, this remembering of who you truly are beyond all the temporary identifications of the conditioned mind, is the essence of the spiritual journey, and it is available to you right now, in this very moment, as you read these words. The journey of 1,000 miles doesn't just begin with a single step, it only ever happens one step at a time, and that step is always taken in the now.